Good evening, everyone. It's really exciting to be able to speak with you all virtually as it is this evening. So thank you, Edith, for that introduction. As Edith said, I'm a tutorial fellow in biology at Balliol College. I am an associate professor of the pandemic. I started in July 2020 last year, as Edith mentioned. So this evening, I'm going to present some of my research group's work on human-wildlife conflict. Some of you may be familiar with this expression, human-wildlife conflict. For many people, it evokes scenes of lions killing livestock, or as you see here, elephants raiding crops. At its base, we are dealing with a problem between humans and wildlife, and this is problematic, largely because people are very complex beasts. They have very complex preferences and motivations, which are sometimes unknown to them and often unknown to us when we're trying to influence or change or understand their behavior. And on the other hand, wildlife populations often defy our predictive ability. In many cases, we don't know why or if they're going to go extinct, or on the flip side, if they're going to become invasive. So this makes human-wildlife conflict a really tricky problem for managers to solve. But there are other challenges involved with managing human-wildlife conflict, and these concern tensions between different arms of global policy. So, for example, in the 20th century, what we've seen around the world has been a really strong push for wildlife protection. So this has led to a number of different international and national agreements. You can see here CITES, so the Convention for International Trade in Endangered Species, and also the International Whaling Commission. However, at the same time, there has also been a really strong push towards fulfilling sustainable development goals, with a focus on improving livelihoods, human livelihoods, particularly in less developed goals. So there can be a really strong disconnect between these two different policy arms, where on the one hand, we want to protect wildlife, and on the other, we want to improve or maintain the livelihoods, the welfare of vulnerable human communities. And so what we often see in human-wildlife conflict is that turning our attention towards one goal, trying to improve protection for wildlife, can often have detrimental impacts on our second goal, which is to look after human livelihoods or welfare. This disconnect is really clear in the marine environment. So what we've seen in the marine environment through the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries and into the 19th centuries has been international whaling around the world. So exploitation of marine mammal species and often harvesting of other marine mammals such as sea lions and seals, so pinnipeds. So this has often been for meat, for blubber, for the furs in the case of seals, and often just to get rid of them because they were nuisance animals which competed with fisheries. So we have estimates that we think marine mammal populations sort of declined on average by about 71% relative to historical abundance levels. So around the world, what we saw was a really large decline in these animal populations. In response to that, in the 20th century, what we've seen has been the general sort of global increase in protection for wildlife for these marine mammal species. So you might be familiar with the US in the United States, the Marine Mammal Protection Act from the 70s. We have a similar Marine Mammal Protection Act in the UK, which protects different species. So because of this sort of global increase in protection for marine mammals, for whales, for sea lions and seals, what we've seen has been a recovery in these populations. So from the conservation side, this is excellent. Recoveries in these populations is really good to see. But what's meant or what's happened as these populations have recovered is that tensions or conflict with fisheries has exploded around the world. So many marine mammal species are in direct competition with fisheries. So you can see here on this right-hand side, this is a picture of a seal or a sea lion has taken big chunks out of this fish. And the other impacts we can see are that marine mammals can become entangled with fishing gear, or they can be caught as bycatch. What this means for fishers is often a really large negative impact on their fishing catch. So they lose a lot of their catch and they sustain really large economic losses because of these damage to gear. So what we often see from the fisher's perspective is that this perception that these global policies which are protecting marine mammals are doing so at the expense of their own welfare. So it's in this point, this intersection, where much of my research group's work is based. So on the one hand, we're assessing the preferences and, importantly, the motivations of human populations with regards to their interactions with wildlife. And on the other, we're determining how these wildlife populations are likely to respond to different management scenarios, so attempts to manage conflict, but also to changes in environmental conditions. The first research question that I'm going to share with you this evening concerns this first element. So what are the preferences and motivations driving human interactions with wildlife? So once again, here our focus is the marine environment, so where marine mammals are in conflict with fisheries. Of the different marine mammal species that interact with fisheries, sea lions and seals are those that tend to generate the most controversy. I suppose that they're maybe not as charismatic as whales, as their larger marine mammal cousins. They're just the right size to really aggravate fisheries tensions. And so our focus is on conflict with these animals. So when you see where pinnipeds, so pinnipeds is a sort of catch-all term that includes sea lions and seals and walruses. But when you see where pinnipeds are found around the globe and compare this with fishing activities, you can understand why they generate such extreme tensions with fisheries. So this is a map of the spatial distribution of different pinniped populations. This is created using data from the IUCN. So I think you can see my mouse. So up here you can see the UK. We have the grey seal and the harbour seal. So we have Halocaris grypus, the grey seal, and Phoca vitulina, which is the harbour seal, in these areas. Other concentrations of pinniped populations, you typically see them in coastal areas. That's because most pinnipeds will breed on shore. Let's contrast that with a global distribution of fisheries catch. So this is from a paper by Hicks and al. In Nature in 2019. And you can see on this vertical axis increasing levels of fishing catch, where dark purple indicates higher catch. This is millions of tons per year. So we can see immediately that there's, once again, this really strong coastal concentration of fisheries effort. And when we compare that with where our pinnipeds are located, we see really great potential for some overlap between these two actors. So particularly we see lots of overlap in Northern Europe, where we can see these grey and harbour seals are located, but also on the west coasts of North and South America. So I'm just going to show you a video which hopefully gives you a bit more of an indication of what fishers are up against when they're interacting with sea lions and seals in these areas. So this is in North America, this is in Alaska, and these are the stellar sea lions. So you can understand, you can just see the net in this picture, this little line of buoys indicating the edges of the net. You can understand how much difficulty that fishers are having when they're attempting to catch any fish or to have sort of normal operations in these areas where sea lions occur. Okay, so the logical questions that arise when we're attempting to manage human-wildlife conflict are first to understand what is the impact of these interactions with sea lions or seals on fishers' welfare. So often fishers complain about economic impacts, they complain about the difficulties they have carrying out normal fishing activities, but it's important for us to understand these impacts so we can understand how to manage them. Linked with that, when we're thinking about management solutions, what we really want to know is, from a fisher's perspective, what are the key problems that they have with these sea lion species, or the sea lions or seals, or other marine mammals, and that can help us target our management actions to address their concerns. We don't want to offer them economic compensation if it turns out that they weren't really concerned about the economic impacts at all. Okay, so the area of the world where I'm going to take you now, a bit further away than most of us are able to travel at present. This is Peru and Chile, so the west coast of South America. So this area, Peru and Chile are really large fishing nations. They're among the top 10 countries in the world in terms of fisheries landings. So Chilean and Peruvian boats land lots of fish each year, among the top 10 of most global nations. So the reason that they have such a productive fishery is because they're right on the eastern upwelling So this is one of the really, one of the most productive upwelling areas in the world. And what we see is it supports really large fish populations, which are great for fisheries, but of course also great for pinniped species. So in this area of South America, we have two main pinniped species, which is the South American fur seal and the South American sea lion. So interactions between fishers and these two animals, the South American fur seal and the South American sea lion, have really, they've been increasing over the last couple of decades. So we've seen increasing sort of protestation from fishers, reports of conflict with these two animals. The image on the left of your screen we spoke about earlier, that's an example of what these animals can do to fisheries catch. But then the flip side, of course, is that sea lions and seals can become entangled in fishing nets. Sometimes fishers will defend their catch by shooting seals or sea lions, or by clubbing them on the head, or by using dynamite, or any one of a range of activities. This is problematic for multiple reasons in these regions. First of all, because these are protected species, so harming them is illegal. It encourages fishers to have guns on board, which sparks a whole range of social issues independent of their problems with sea lions. You can see that this issue has been dramatized quite heavily in the press in recent years. This top right image is from the Chilean newspaper from 2018. And it describes this really dramatic fight between fishers and sea lions for food. So all of these images give you an indication of public sentiment, current public sentiment towards this issue, and what the sort of different sides of the story. So this is our highly charismatic South American sea lion. The scientific name is Otaria flavescens, and as I mentioned, it's a protected species in Peru and Chile. And it's often really, the finger gets pointed at this animal most because the abundance of this species is quite high in these areas. So it's described as an opportunistic predator, goes after a range of prey species, forages in the surface coastal waters. And what's really key for us here is that it has these highly developed cognitive abilities. And this is a problem for fisheries because it's just behavior has changed from going out and hunting its prey to sitting back and waiting for a fishing boat to come along. And fishers will tell you that they've often observed sea lions following a boat, and then as soon as the nets are brought up, that sea lion will bark out some noise and attract other sea lions. And then before they know it, they've got sort of 30 or 40 sea lions ready for the net to come up to start stealing some fish from it. So in terms of what's happened with this species in our areas in Peru and Chile over the last latter half of the 20th century, in both of our countries, we've had this really quite steep increase in these populations. So Peru and Chile were again big sealing countries, and these populations, this species was actually at very sort of lower levels at the start of the 20th century. But with the increase of our, with the introduction of our protective legislation, these populations have increased over time. So the approach that we took in this research was to survey fishers along the coast of Peru and Chile. And again, our motivation here was to understand, on the one hand, what fishers' motivations were, why were they concerned about their interactions with sea lions, and then two, to understand what the impact of these interactions are on their catch and also their fishing income. We used a survey method called best-worst scaling, which I'll take you through shortly. And we interviewed fishers at 17 ports in Chile, which are these lower black dots on this map of South America, and then at 10 ports in Peru. So again, these black dots in the north of the coastline. We also got some information on socioeconomic characteristics and also some attitudinal questions. So here I mentioned we're in this great upwelling region, and this is the Humboldt Current, which is partly responsible for that upwelling. Okay, so to give you an idea of fishers' general impressions of sea lions, we asked an open access question to our respondents saying, when you hear the word sea lion, what's the first word that comes to your mind? And as you can see from this word cloud, it's not a positive response. So I think we quoted maybe 95% of our responses towards this phrase were negative, and the rest were either positive or neutral. So the size of the words in this word cloud indicates the frequency with which they were mentioned. So our next step then was to understand what were the drivers of conflict from fishers' perspective. What aspect about their interactions with sea lions was really concerning to them. And we were interested in this information because we want to think about tailoring our management solutions to actually address the main concerns that fishers have. So we assessed a range of possible reasons for concern or drivers of conflict. These range from concerns about having to change their fishing strategy, employment concerns. Fishers might have to move out of fishing if interactions with sea lions get too high. There's reputational impacts for the fishery. Sea lions catch fish. They also damage gear, so fishers have higher input costs and lower profits. There's some safety concerns, time spent away from their families. Sea lions can pose risks. They're very large animals. So if you're in a relatively small fishing boat, working with these animals quite close to you, it can be quite threatening. We thought that maybe fishers might be concerned about harm to these animals. Behavioral implications. I mentioned that sea lions' behavior is changing, but maybe they were also concerned that the populations were just too large or increasing. So for those of you who are interested, this is what our survey looks like. It's called Best Worst Scaling, and fishers see a range of questions where 4 of these different drivers are included every time, and we get them to select what most concerns them and what least concerns them. So very happy to chat about this method more in our discussions, but I won't go into it in too much detail now. So the idea is that we can use fishers' responses to these questions to rank these different drivers of conflict and understand the relative concern amongst these different options. So when we look at across our sample, so this was a sample of 300 fishers across Peru and Chile, we can look at how important each of these different concerns might be relative to the others. And what we actually find is it was not as I expected that these economic concerns were the top driver. They were important for fishers, but fishers were mainly concerned that there's just too many sea lions. And if you think back to that figure where we showed the population increase over time, you can understand that from fishers' perspectives, there are a lot of sea lions. There are a lot more sea lions now than when they may have started fishing. And actually, when we assess fishers' perception of how their interactions with sea lions have changed over time, we see that generally there's been an increase of about a 10% increase in interactions with sea lions every decade. So every year there's a 1% increase in the numbers of interactions that fishers have with sea lions. So fishers are concerned about having too many sea lions. They are also concerned about these economic impacts. So they have to spend more money to repair damaged gear or to travel further, and they're getting less money for damage catch, which is what you'd expect, because in our region, in these regions in Peru and Chile, these are very small scale fishers. Many of them are earning less than the minimum wage. They're the principal income earners in their households, and fishing is their main form of economic activity. So this result is useful for us, but we have a very heterogeneous sample across our coast of Peru and Chile. And the next question that we had was whether there were different sentiment amongst our population of fishers. Does everyone have similar views, or are there groups of fishers who might have slightly different perceptions? So to assess that, we used what's called a scale-adjusted latent class model. Again, happy to discuss that further in the Q&A, but I won't go into much detail now. So using our scale-adjusted latent class model, we can identify groups of fishers who have similar perceptions, so shared perceptions within their groups. We identified 4 groups of fishers with different preferences. And we've called these here capacity focused in green, alternative livelihoods, economically minded, and lifestyle impacts. And as you might expect based on their names that we've chosen, they each have slightly different concerns about sea lions. So for these 3, lifestyle impacts, economically minded, and alternative livelihoods, this concern about the increase in population numbers is the key driver of their concern about interactions with sea lions. But for the economically minded, they have a really strong focus on inputs and profits. So this group of fishers is about 30% of the sample. Our alternative livelihoods, fishers are concerned about impacts on fish in terms of lost catch but they're also concerned about the profits that they're getting from fisheries. Others, like our lifestyle impacts, are concerned about safety concerns. So they're having to fish further offshore to avoid sea lions, and that increases the danger to them as fishers. And they're also concerned about spending more time away from their families. And our fourth group, capacity focused, has this similar mix of concern about the increasing input costs, but also about their safety and about their time spent away from their families. So we can use this information about these sort of heterogeneous preferences in our group of respondents to put together management solutions which are sensitive to the needs and differences in opinion of these different groups of fishers. So what we can do is, in the marine realm, we're still in our infancy, sort of early days, working out best management practices, optimal management practices to deal with human-wildlife conflict. Whereas in the terrestrial zone, back with our lions and our elephants, there's been more development, there's been more innovation to think of different ways that we could manage conflict. So we can borrow some of those approaches and apply them here to our fisheries. And specifically, we can think about 4 different types of management solutions. So they're in here in these black boxes. So we can think of management culls, so culling a proportion of our sea lion population. Economic incentives, so this can be the form of compensation or insurance schemes. We can think of capacity building, training programs, or information sharing. And we can think about helping fishers to transition to different industries, related but different industries. So marine mammal ecotourism is something that's starting to increase or to appear in Chile and Peru, and that's an area where fishers can take their existing capital or their fishing boats and their training and their knowledge and apply it to a similar industry, but where instead of competing with sea lions, instead sea lions become the source of their income. So based on what we know are the different views and perceptions of our different groups of fishers, we can recommend different combinations of these management solutions to attempt to address this conflict. So the majority of our sample, these 3 groups are really focused on population numbers. We can think of population culls, but sometimes these culls will be most effective when they're used with economic incentives. Similarly, economic incentives are like the spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. So we can think of insurance schemes or compensation as being helpful when we're transitioning fishers into into marine mammal ecotourism, or we're helping them with training programs and building their capacity in terms of their ability to change their fishing practices to minimize the impacts of sea lion depredation. So the next aspect of this research is to understand the impact that sea lions are having on fishers. This is a tricky one to answer with great confidence, because what we're assessing in this case are fishers' perceptions of the impacts that sea lions have on their catch and also on their income. So I'm sure thinking ahead, you can see some potential here for some misrepresentation of the true impacts of sea lion depredation on fishers' catch and income. So fishers are going to have an incentive to overstate these impacts, and that makes it really difficult for us when we're working out compensation or other financial incentives. Nevertheless, we can still think of these numbers as an indication of how the damages that fishers are experiencing. So the overwhelming majority of fishers in the sample indicate that they're losing upwards of 26% of their catch. So about 80% think they're losing more than 26, and that some fishers are sort of thinking they're losing more like 50%. In terms of income losses, different side of the same coin, about 95% of fishers thinking they're losing about 80% of their income, more than 20% of their income. So from fishers' perspectives, this is a really important management issue for them. This is an area where they need their marine managers, the policymakers, to be changing things up, to be managing this conflict, because it's having very serious economic impacts on their livelihoods. The other side of the coin is to understand what the impact of fishers are on sea lions. So in this survey that I've discussed, we also asked fishers whether they were defending their catch from sea lions. And as part of those questions, we get this estimate that around 60% of vessels, boats in their area are killing sea lions in order to defend their catch. So this, again, remember, is a protected species and it's illegal to harm sea lions. So this is quite a high number. So this speaks to sort of a delegitimization of marine policy, and that's concerning for various reasons. But we're also worried because, if you remember, this is still a recovering species. So it wasn't that long ago that these populations were, decimated. So we are concerned about the trajectory of this population over time. So we can unpick these results a little bit more. On the left-hand side, this is Peru, and on the right-hand side, this is Chile. This is showing, with the map, we're seeing the ports where we interviewed fishers, and the size of the dot indicates the number of fishing boats which are registered as working from that port. And on the left-hand plot, we can see an estimate of the average number of sea lions killed every month by an average boat in these areas. So again, there's a lot of uncertainty around this. These are illegal behaviors, so it can often be difficult to get accurate responses from fishers. But generally, we can see that it's a number greater than 0. So we know that some sea lions are being killed each month. Generally, they tend to have estimates hover around the 5 sea lions per month. We get obviously some overstated estimates, thinking that a boat would kill 20 sea lions per month. It's a similar story in Chile. On the right-hand side here, again, we've got a greater range of fishing boats. In the south, we see estimates of slightly more sea lions killed each month. It's sort of hovering around the 7 mark. In the central region, slightly less, and in the north, slightly less again. Okay, so what we see then is this really two-sided story. We're concerned about protecting populations of sea lions. We know that these populations have been decimated over time, and they're starting to recover, and that recovery is generating these real economic impacts on our fisheries organizations. And linked to that is this concern by fishers that they're having, there's these really large population increases. We see different perspectives amongst groups of fishers in terms of what are the really key causes of concern, and we can use that information to tailor our management solutions. So it's worth mentioning that over 70% of fishers think that this problem should be solved with culls. So we should kill some percentage of the sea lion population each year in order to reduce their impacts on fisheries. So culls are often, or have been used in terrestrial settings, wolves and bears. Generally, we think in the terrestrial realm that culls really only help to manage public sentiment. They're a way for people to sort of let off steam, but they maybe don't do anything about these predator-prey interactions. In the marine realm, we have very little understanding of what would be the impact of population culls on the continued viability of these populations through time. So this is an area of ongoing work in my research group, this attempting to understand how these wildlife populations will respond to different management actions, culls in this case, but also to the broader environmental conditions which are influencing them. So I mentioned in this previous research, we saw that the key concern for most fishers was this perception that sea lion and seal populations are just exploding. When we look to the published literature for evidence to see if this is actually the case, we see very little support for this. So this is population growth rate on the horizontal axis. This dashed yellow line indicates a population growth rate of 1. So that's a stationary population, neither increasing or decreasing. Populations to the right-hand side of this line are increasing, and populations to the left-hand side are decreasing. So looking at 11 pinniped species for which we have data around the world, on average, their growth rates are tending towards the decreasing side. There's very little evidence to say that these populations are exploding. Some species, though, like the New Zealand fur seal, I think it is, Phocartus hookeri, it's the New Zealand sea lion, apologies, they have growth rates estimated around 1.2, and that is a really large rate of increase. So thinking about management, population culls might actually be appropriate in that case. On the other hand, we have very little idea of what is happening to the populations of sea lions in this area, this part of South America. So the research question here then is, how is the population of this species going to change into the future? So we've mentioned management culls. Culling parts of the population are definitely the most popular strategy amongst fishers. And historically, these have been the management actions that governments have used to reduce conflict between sea lions and seals and fisheries. On the other hand, populations in this part of the world are also subject to really extreme climate, which has impacts on prey availability. And so these populations have to cope with these really large disturbances through time. So what we don't know is, as marine managers, as policy advisors, is what's going to happen to this population if we don't do anything, and if we have sort of stable climate conditions and they don't have any of these extreme fluctuations. And then we need to understand what's going to be the impact of these management goals, what could be the impact. And then we need to know how that will interact with prevailing climate conditions. Because we could see cases where the population can sustain management goals or extreme climate events, but not the two of them combined. So to undertake this analysis, we can use demographic methods. Excuse me, demographic methods. So matrix population models in this case. Some of you may be familiar with these methods. Essentially, we're discretizing our population into different stages. We're thinking about babies and juveniles and adults, breeding adults and non-breeding adults, and we can track how these proportions of the population change through time. And it allows us to have a more nuanced understanding of how populations grow and change. So this is a life cycle graph of our species, the South American sea lion. In the red, we've got our adults, our adult females. This is a female-only model. And on the left-hand side in the yellow, we have juveniles. So from our field data, we can collect information on adult survival. This parameter here, we can look at fecundity. So how many babies does the average adult female have? We can think about the likelihood that these juvenile animals will survive, this term here, and whether they'll grow. So when they grow, they become adults. And when they don't grow, but they survive, they stay as juveniles. So we can take these terms and put them into a matrix format. So here's our survival of juveniles without maturing to adults, survival of juveniles transitioning to adults, female fecundity, so reproduction, and then adult female survival. So using this information about their vital rates, we can combine this information with a vector of the population at different stages. So how many juveniles are in our population and how many adults? And we can project this population forward in time by iterating this expression at every time period. Okay, so in this analysis then, the question is to understand what is going to happen to this Chilean population of the sea lion over the next 30 years. Specifically, we're interested in understanding whether this population is likely to persist or to go quasi-extinct. So when we say quasi-extinct, by that we understand that there is not enough genetic variability in the population left for it to be viable. So we assume that that population, if not yet extinct, is functionally extinct. And then we also want to assess the impacts of culls and extreme climate events on this quasi-extinction probability. Okay, so this is what's happening. I'm just nervously looking at the time. Edith, are we? Great, we're at 30. We were a while ago. Thanks for that, Edith. So at this point, we have, this is our base case scenario. So we're seeing the change in population through time. This is our starting population. It's about 100,000 females, both juveniles and adult. This is our population size on the vertical axis and our time on the horizontal axis. So we're looking at what's going to happen to this population of 100,000 females over the next 30 years. And these lines indicate the average of these different population stages. And each of these lines is a model iteration. So as you can imagine, we've got considerable uncertainty about what's going to happen to these populations through time. And we can sort of express that uncertainty by assessing a range of distributions around these values. Okay, so importantly, our population is clearly declining over time. It actually has a growth rate of less than 1, so we would expect it to decline over time. So this is in contrast to Fisher's perceptions that populations are exploding. But this population does not become functionally extinct over the time frame of our analysis. On the other hand, if we bring in our management culls, that might actually change. So we've got different management culls. We can think about culling 15% of adult females in year 1. We could cull 10% of our adult females every year, or we could cull 30% of adult females every 5 years. And so obviously these are going to have different management costs and benefits. It's going to be easier or harder to cull different adult females over time, but we want to understand the impact of these culls on the population. So these are our results. When we cull 15% of adult females in year 1, once again, our population never goes past this quasi-extinction threshold. So it's declining, but in theory still viable within a 30-year time horizon. With our next 2 cull scenarios, though, we start to see this quasi-extinction threshold reached. So this means these are these vertical dashed lines. So I think this is about 23 years into the future. If we cull 10% of adult females every year, that population is going to decline past the point where we think that it's viable. That point is pushed out if we cull 30% of adult females every 5 years. It's about in year 27 that population is no longer viable. So really, from this perspective, managed culls are a pretty poor choice if we're thinking about the best ways to manage this human-wildlife conflict while maintaining, while protecting our wildlife species. The next element that we can assess is, apologies as I bring up my various bits and pieces. The next elements that we can assess are the impacts of climate. So you may be familiar with the El Nino effects, the El Nino southern oscillation. So what happens is that we see these in El Nino years, we see elevated sea surface temperatures, which push across to the west coast of South America and up into Central America. These increased sea surface temperatures basically mean a drop in prey availability. So what we tend to see is that many marine mammals and seabirds starve. So you may have heard of these impacts in the news. These extreme climate conditions are extreme El Nino events. They're far less frequent, but their impacts are much more severe. Again, like all El Nino events, they last 12 to 18 months. And in our study area, we're really concerned about these extreme El Nino events. So they're extreme, they don't happen they're not the case that every time there's an El Nino, it's extreme, but when they do happen, their effects are devastating. So in the 1997-98 extreme El Nino event, we lost 100% of our juvenile seals and sea lions. This is this animal here. We lost 60% of our adult females, and we had a reduction in fecundity, so reproduction of about 90%, 95%. So as you might expect, the frequency of these extreme events has been increasing over time. In the last century, we saw one of these events, roughly 1 in every 20 years. And now, and until 2019, it's predicted that these events are going to happen 1 in every 10 years. So you might think to yourself that the impact of losing all of your juveniles and 60% of your adult females on the population of these South American sea lion would be quite extreme. We do see these impacts when we look at our population projection model and we include these extreme climate effects. We do see that these extreme climate effects tip our population past this quasi-extinction threshold in about it's before the 30-year period. So once again, this is our population size on the vertical axis. Each of these lines indicates an iteration of our model incorporating different possible values that our vital rates could take. And we're looking at time on the horizontal axis. The really important question then becomes, what is the combined impact of culls and climate? So we expected our population to persist in the absence of both of these effects. When we introduced culls, we saw we saw that our populations went past that quasi-extinction threshold for the majority of our cull scenarios. And what happens when we include climate scenarios is that for our scenario A, where we cull 15% of adult females in year 1, introducing climate is enough for that population to go past this quasi-extinction threshold. And what's happened is that we've moved that threshold forward in time for these other 2 cull scenarios. So really from this, we can see that culls are not a great solution for this human-wildlife conflict, but when you combine them with the impacts of extreme climate events through time, the effects could be quite devastating on the persistence of these populations. So this is what I've just mentioned. Our population is likely to decline over time. really what it shows is that our conflicts with fisheries are going to need to be managed with different tools. And we spoke about some of these tools earlier in the talk. We think about insurance or some capacity building approaches, transitioning fisheries into ecotourism. What's important to note here is that we have very little information on these rates of juvenile growth or survival, which is specific to this species in South America. And that's really true for many marine mammals around the world. We have marine mammals are difficult to observe because they spend most of their lives in the water. And so we have very little understanding, we have very little certainty in terms of what these populations are doing over time. And that you saw in the wide distribution of those projections of all the different model iterations. Okay, so finishing up, coming back to our earlier research questions, how do pinnipeds affect fishers' welfare? From fishers' perspectives, they have very large negative impacts on catch and on income. And fishers often feel quite victimized in this sense. They have this sense that the government policy is favoring marine mammals at their expense. What are the drivers of conflict? On the west coast of South America, the key driver is this perception that these populations are exploding, that they're just too large. But on the flip side, how are these wildlife populations likely to respond to potential management solutions or other environmental conditions? And generally that's quite negative. So what we would recommend in these cases is a precautionary principle. We need to assume that these populations, although they might appear to be exploding, that generally there's not a lot of evidence for that, and they need to be managed with a view to the buffer space being allowed for them to buffer these extreme climate events. So as ever, this work is the result of collaborations from around the world, some of my collaborators in Oxford and other ways. And I'll stop there and thank you very much for your attention.